Reharmonization is a large part of jazz composition, and one of the ways that reharmonization is developed is through using a technique we call chord substitution. Chord substitution is not a new concept. Classical music composers of all styles of music, use chord substitution on a regular basis. So we'll take a look at that concept here with the use of the predominant chord. So if you look here, we have a list of the predominant chords in a tune by, say, Beethoven. We'll look at this in the key of G. And so one of the things we'll notice right off the bat is that there are many common tones between these chords: A's, C's, E's, and various inflections of those pitches. Now, when we look a little bit deeper, we recognize that these tones will have similar tendencies. And the tendencies that they have make them want to move towards the dominant, or they somehow support their resolution to the dominant. So in the key of G, the dominant chord would be D, F sharp, A, and C. So if we look at these pitches, we can see that the E and the E flat and the C sharp all will have a tendency to lead to the D, which is the root, of course, of the dominant chord here. The A and the C are actually chord tones, so they can be simply held over or maintained across a chord change. And then the pitch G, of course, will want to move down to the third of the dominant chord, the leading tone. So because all of these different chords have common tones, and those tones have similar tendencies, they can essentially be substituted for each other. Now, they do each have their own unique flavor, but they essentially serve the same purpose. Here are the types of substitution that we'll take a look at. The first is by taking a chord and then adding its extensions in tertium harmony, using alterations for the chords that are already given, examining how we can substitute chords that are related by third to the chords that we have in the song, a special kind of jazz substitution which is called flat five substitution. It's not something you see in classical music very much. And, of course, secondary dominance is another possibility. So let's take a look at extensions first of all. Essentially, you can always tack on the 7th, 9th, 11th, or 13th, or a combination of those. In fact, it's unusual to see simple triads at all. Which 7th, 9th, 11th, and 13th that you use is dependent both on the basic theory of jazz chords and also on the context, as you will see. Generally, you want to use the melody as a guideline to tell you whether you're on the right track or not. So let's take a look at this here. If we look at the first chord and we want to figure out, well, what chord extensions can we use? And remember, in jazz harmony, the minor chord extends according to the Dorian scale. So the basic triad here would be C, E flat, G, and then we would use B flat for the 7th, D for the 9th, F for the 11th, and A natural for the 13th. Those are all the notes in the Dorian scale. So we do see that the 7th and the 9th and the 11th are actually represented here in the melody. And so we can freely use those. Now, the 13th is a little bit problematic, and we have to look a little bit deeper because we have some conflicting evidence here. First of all, the A flat, or the A that's in the key signature is an A flat, not an A natural. And when we look at the chord that immediately follows the chord C minor, it's an F minor, which has an A flat in it also. These are two strong indicators that the sound that is going to be appropriate here would be A flat. Now, the only way to tell really for sure is to try it and see what it sounds like. But there's some evidence here that would suggest that maybe you should avoid the 13th in this case. All right, now, in the key of E flat, the F minor chord would actually be the chord that relates to the Dorian scale starting in E flat. And so we can pretty much assume that all of the regular extensions are going to work here. What we can see in the melody is actually the 9th, but no other notes are represented. But the key signature does definitely imply that the normal 11th, the perfect 11th, and the normal 13th, the major 13th, are the ones that would be appropriate here. In general, jazz musicians don't tend to put extensions onto a minor 7 flat 5. Now this is a sweeping generalization which isn't quite so true, but certainly for the purposes of this class, just leave the half diminished chord or the minor 7 flat 5 alone, because one way to look at it is that it already is altered. And so putting another alteration on it might seem too much. These three chords here give our ear the strong impression of a change of key. And so the reason why I point this out is because here, even though the key signature doesn't change, orally, our ear does think that the key has changed to the key of D flat major. So that changes the context and therefore what extensions we might want to use. In the key of D flat, the E flat minor 7th would be the 2 minor 7th, and then this would be the 5 7, and then this would be the 1 major 7th. So if we look at that, the E flat minor 7th would relate to the Dorian scale, so it will have normal extensions all the way up through the 13th. This A flat would be based on A flat mixolydian, and so it would have all of its normal extensions up through the 13th. And the same thing is true of the D flat major. Now, one thing I would point out here is that you should probably avoid using a perfect 11th over a D flat major 7th chord. It just doesn't sound very good. So when you look at the next category, which is alterations of chords, we enter into a realm of chords which tend to have a little bit more tension than chords that are strictly within the key. And that's where their interest comes in, is because they add more color, they add some chromaticism. Generally, the altering pitches are 5ths, 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths. The 7th and the 3rd are not altered because they are the notes which actually define the type of chord that we're talking about, whether minor 7th or dominant 7th or major 7th. And then, of course, the root. We don't alter the root. That would change the whole chord. Again, context is important, and again, you use the melody as sort of a guideline for which types of alterations you might want to make. So let's look at this song again, and I would point out a few things. One is that minor 7th chords tend not to handle alterations well. You don't see minor 7th chords with flat 9s or with sharp 9s or flat 13s. You just don't. So minor 7ths are really kind of limited to extensions and not so much with alterations. Same thing is true of the half diminished. Because it is already an altered chord, it's not, there's nothing left to alter. This chord is interesting though, because when we look at the melody notes against this chord, we can see that this one might be a good representative for some alterations. So for example, this note here, if we respelled it as an A sharp, would be the sharp 9 of a G chord. Because in a way, the B natural in the G chord is already the third, so we don't want to have a chord that has two different thirds in it. So we have a B natural as the third, and then we would spell this B flat as an A sharp, and then it would be the augmented ninth. And then this note, the A flat, would be the flatted ninth. So instead of having the regular ninth, which goes normally with a G dominant chord, which would be A, we have either A sharp or A flat. You can also try other alterations. You could sharp the 11th, you could flat the 13th, and all of those would sound quite appropriate in this context right here. Here's another dominant 7th chord. Now in this case, though, the melody doesn't really give us any indications as to which alterations, because the A flat is actually a chord tone of the A flat, it's the root, and the G flat is the 7th of the A flat 7th, so it doesn't really hint at what kind of alterations we might use. So in this context, the best thing to do would be to try some and see what you think. Maybe do an A flat 9th chord with a sharp 11th, or try a sharp 9 chord or a flat 9 chord and see what you think. This is kind of a trial by brute force, and then listening and having your ear tell you, does this work or does it not work? Any of these possible alterations might work, because none of these will actually conflict with the melody notes themselves. Major sevenths have a limited number of alterations that you can make. One that almost always works on a major 7th chord is a sharp 11th. It's a really pleasing and very jazz-like sound. The only other tone that alters well for a major 7th chord would be the 5th. You can try either the sharp 5th or the flat 5th. However, it's a very distinctive and kind of dark sound, which in most contexts is a little too tense. All right, substituting chords whose roots are related by thirds is another very important possibility. And so this is basically what we refer to as mediants in classical music. We have three kinds of mediants: diatonic mediants, chromatic mediants, and doubly chromatic mediants. Jazz tends not to use doubly chromatic mediants at all. I can't think of a single situation where I've heard something like that. Now that I've said that, of course there's got to be some somewhere, but it's just not used very much. So let's first look at diatonic mediants, and this is how they work. And they work basically on the same principle, that the common tones between the chords are prevalent enough that we hear them as very similar sounds. So if we're using a C minor 7th and we want to find the chords that are closely related to that as mediant substitutes, diatonic mediant substitutes, we go down a third to A flat C, E flat G, or we go up a third to E flat G, B flat D. And we can see that both of these chords share three common tones with our original chord, and the tone that isn't common is related by one step to the other note in the original chord. So these are very similar. All right, so now let's take a look at these and see if we can figure out some possibilities. So in the boxes, what I would like to do is have you figure out what sort of mediant relationship chord can go in there. So we could put, in the first box next to the C minor chord, we could either put E flat major 7th, or we could put A flat major 7th. In this case, I'll just pick A flat major 7th. So figure out what would be the next one. What chord would be related to F minor that would be third related? In other words, where the root is related by a third and it shares the most possible common tones. So in this case, the answer would be either a D flat major 7 or an A flat major 7. The melody note here is an F. So that note is actually in the D flat major 7, but it's not in the A flat major 7. And then interestingly, the note after, the chord after, is a D natural. And so maybe the D flat would be a good way to move to this next chord. What about the D half diminished chord? Well, if you fish around a little bit, you'll figure out that a B flat ninth chord has all of the notes of a D half diminished chord, but just has an extra bass note. The next one, another substitution for the C minor. We already used the A flat major 7th before, so let's use the E flat major 7th this time. And then finally one more substitution. We'll find one here for the D flat major 7th. Now, in the key of D flat major, when we go down a third, we would get to B flat, so it could be a B flat minor 7th chord. If we go up to the third, it would be an F, and it would be an F minor. Notice that when you're using diatonic mediants, the related chord is the opposite type of sonority. So if you start with a minor chord, the diatonic mediant will be a major chord. If you start with a major chord, then the diatonic mediant will be a minor chord. So in this case, let's use a B flat. All right, so that's how you do diatonic mediants. This really spices up this chord progression quite a lot. All right, chromatic mediant substitutes are where you use chords which are of the same basic type as the original chord. In other words, either minor or major, depending on what you start with. And then you add the sevenths on from there. So in this case, there are two chords that we could use that go with the C minor chord, C minor 7th. One would be A minor 7th, and one would be A flat minor 7th. Those are both down a third. One is down a major third, one's down a minor third. In this case, I also put in this other one, the A minor 7 flat 5, and you can see why, because the A minor 7 flat 5 actually has 3 common tones with our original one, whereas the other two do not. Now, if we go a third up, we get E minor 7 and E flat minor 7, and then again I put in the E minor 7 flat 5 because it shares, it's a little bit more, there are more common tones with our original. Now, many of these notes are actually kind of dangerous. I'm going to circle these with, with red circles, because these notes will actually sort of negate the basic flavors of the C minor chord. And so chromatic mediants are really not used very much. You have to really be careful with chromatic mediant substitutes. All right, flat 5 substitution is a specific type of common tone substitution which is based on dominant 7th chords, and it takes advantage of the way a tritone wants to resolve. So let's take a look at this example here. I've got a B flat dominant 7 with a flat 9, and it has the notes B flat, D, F, A flat, C flat. And then underneath that I've written the chord a tritone away. That's the same type of chord. So it's an E7 flat 9, which has the notes E, G sharp, B, D, and F. Now, when we compare these two, you can see that the D and the F are common to both. And then the G sharp and the A flat are just the same note. They're just enharmonically spelled differently. And same thing with the B and the C flat. So in other words, the B flat 7 flat 9 chord and the E7 flat 9 chord are identical except for their bass note. That's the only note that's different. So because of the basic notion of common tone substitution, we can substitute these two for each other. So let's look at some of these here. So if we want to look at this one, in the first box, the chord that's given is a G7 with a sharp 9. And so we would substitute the chord which is a tritone away, which would be D flat. And I just put it alterations because since the first one is altered, we may as well keep some alterations in here. And what's interesting then is that this creates a chromatic movement between the bass notes, between the D of the half diminished chord and then a D flat, a half step lower, and then resolving by half step to the final chord C minor 7. All right, what about this next one? The flat 5 substitute, the tritone away from A flat would be D natural, so we would use a D7 in there. And then again, at the bottom, the other box, we would use a D7 altered. So I encourage you to listen to these, what they sound like. Just sit at the piano and play them, and you'll be able to hear right away that, oh yeah, this really does have a sound that you may actually even recognize it if you know jazz a little bit, or at least you'll realize, well, it seems to work just fine. Now, someone who's quite an astute observer might realize that, well, one of the reasons why this works is because the 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 9th, flat 9, of a dominant chord form a diminished 7th chord. And that there are actually more than just the tritone substitutes that share the same notes. In fact, all of these chords here have the same exact pitches in them except for their root. These two at the bottom, though, aren't used as often for substitutions for some reason in jazz. I don't know why that is so much, but for some reason they're just used a little bit less. But that doesn't mean that you can't use them. It's just that they're used a little less. All right, and finally we'll look at the secondary dominants. Now, so the basic rule in using secondary dominants is fundamentally the same as it is in classical music. In other words, any chord can be preceded by its own dominant chord. So if we think of any chord as being temporarily a tonic chord, then we go to the dominant chord in the same key, and then we can put that right before it, and then that seems to resolve just fine. Now in jazz there are a couple of little differences here, and one is that you can substitute the chord that is a 5th above, but which is diatonic. So in other words, if you're on a C minor chord, you could substitute the chord above that, which might be a G minor chord. Let's say we were in the key of B flat. So the chord, the dominant, the secondary dominant, in other words, doesn't necessarily have to be a dominant chord. I guess that would mean that it isn't really a secondary dominant, but it's the same basic idea that you take advantage of that root movement by perfect 5th. Oftentimes in jazz, instead of just substituting the 5 chord as the secondary dominant, they'll substitute both the 2 and the 5 chord in the key. We'll see some examples of that in the music that we look at. And then you can also substitute chords. You can sort of string them together. So you can say, put a secondary dominant, and then you could put a secondary dominant of the secondary dominant, or you could precede that by a secondary dominant of the secondary dominant of the secondary dominant, etc. This is something that is also possible. All right. So if we look at this, you can see how even basically in this tune itself, it's already put together with this concept in mind that many places within this chord progression exhibit a root movement by perfect 5th descending. So like here, 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 and then again here, and then when we do the repeat, again here, going back to the beginning. So we can see that the majority of these chord changes are moving by perfect 5th. These two chords here are substitutes. So in other words, at the very end of this, we really just end on a C minor chord. But because we want to repeat back to the beginning, what is done here is we've substituted this G dominant chord to lead us back to the beginning. In this case, we've actually substituted both the 2 and the 5 in C minor, and that puts us back to the beginning. This particular spot is referred to as a turnaround. In other words, it turns us around to the beginning of the chord progression. Now, we'll have another exercise that will cover secondary dominants specifically. So for now, we will end the discussion on chord substitutions.